I just wanted to say welcome to the first live speaker since I think September. And this is an incredible speaker, so we're really blessed to have somebody so talented. And that's going to talk about talent, I suppose, or creativity. But I also wanted to thank all of you for coming and for being here, and Dave for organizing the speakers this term, because I haven't been able to say that since you've not been around. And without further ado, I will let Sophie come up and give the presentation.
Thank you, Seth, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Wohl, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Wohl's research explores processes of judgment across creative industries. She focuses on how aesthetic judgments interact with other forms of judgment, as producers make decisions in a creative process and as others evaluate creative products. Her book, Bound by Creativity, How Contemporary Art is Created and Judged, examines experimentation and social interactions in the field of contemporary art, how artists produce and circulate distinctive bodies of work. Dr. Wohl's exceptional research has won awards from the American Sociological Association sections on culture, theory, and consumers and consumption. It has been published in Sociological Theory, Socioeconomic Review, Politics, American Journal of Culture Sociology, Research, among other venues. In today's talk, Dr. Wohl on more than 100 interviews and 2 years of ethnographic research develops a sociological perspective of creativity through the analytic lens of judgment research. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Wohl. Having me, and I really appreciate that really generous introduction. So I'm really happy to be here in person. It's like a very rare opportunity during the pandemic, especially doing this remotely. So it's just really nice to be on campus and be able to meet you all and engage with the department in person. So in this talk, I'll be discussing some of the ideas in my book, Bound by Creativity, which was published in First into the book cover with cover art by D. Works, and he's one of the artists we're going to meet a bit later. I titled this talk, What is Creativity? The idea of creativity is social. So while we can think of creativity more broadly, we more narrowly designate creativity to a certain scope of decisions made by people who are in particular roles. So in creative industries, this is something that artists or creative producers do when they make creative products. So when I'm addressing this question in the realm of creative industries, I'm really asking, how do artists make these decisions during the creative process? In this process, artists are making aesthetic decisions that ultimately result in creative products. When I talk about aesthetic judgments here, I mean judgments about what constitutes quote-unquote good work of art. While other forms of judgment, like economic judgments, are also important, and they also sort of impact the creative process, aesthetic judgments are key motivators in creative decision making that have not received enough attention in sociology. And the contemporary art market is a particularly interesting place to examine aesthetic judgments in the creative process because there's very little consensus in this field over what counts as good art. So this is a field where anything goes. It's not necessarily about making something that requires that is beautiful, or even something that requires technical skill, but it's sort of about capturing an idea with a form. So we're judging what kind of form captures an abstract theory or emotion or theme, and we don't widely agree about when the forms capture these ideas in an original or compelling way. These are some photos from my ethnography. As you can see, contemporary art can be a clothesline of socks, it can be a pile of rubble, and these works can sell for tens of thousands or sometimes millions of dollars. Sociologists have previously been interested in studying this bizarre world of contemporary art to see how pricing and valuation happen under these conditions of extreme aesthetic uncertainty. But I'm interested in how artists make aesthetic judgments themselves during the creative process in an absence of a clear concept. So I argue that we need to understand how aesthetic judgments
shapes the creative process. And this led me to 3 questions. First, how do artists make aesthetic judgments about their own work as they experiment in the often solitary realm of their studios? Studies of creative production tend to focus on sites where multiple people collaborate to make creative products, like restaurant kitchens or jazz clubs. Previous research, like Howard Becker's Art World approach and Richard Peterson's production of culture approach, focus on how collaboration with others during the creative process results in particular work, as well as on how various organizational properties of cultural fields shape creative decisions. And these are really important questions, but they draw away from focusing on these actual aesthetic judgments during the creative process. Studying contemporary art allowed me to focus on this because unlike chefs or jazz musicians, visual art spend a lot of their time making their work alone. Second, how do these aesthetic judgments unfold over time as artists inform ideas for future work? So most studies of aesthetic judgment in sociology focus on isolated moments of decision making, usually in the process of distributing or consuming creative products rather than in of production. So sociologists have studied why people greenlight certain films, or how our taste shapes the music that we select. And these are important questions again, but they don't help us answer how it evolves during the creative process. So studying the creative process entails studying a sequence of interlocking judgments over time, because artists make a series of decisions as they produce their work. And these decisions are shaped by decisions they've made about previous work. Lastly, how are these aesthetic judgments shaped by others' evaluations of previous work that circulate through the art world? So while I'm studying creative processes that largely occur in solitude, this does not mean that these processes are asocial. By examining artists' understandings of others' evaluations and how these shape the creative process, we can explore creativity as a social process while still keeping the focus on aesthetic judgment itself. So my approach entails studying aesthetic judgment in a way that focuses on creative production, judgments as they unfold over time sequentially, and captures how these judgments are relational. All right, so I'm going to move to the data now. And I conducted my research in New York City, which is the epicenter of the art world, which is a globalized market. And in New York City, both competition and the potential payoff in terms of money and prestige are the highest. I interviewed over 100 artists, dealers, curators, collectors, and art advisors. Art advisors are those who professionally recommend artworks to buy. And because I'm discussing specific works of art, I use subject real names with their permission. I selected artists working in different media and styles, as well as differing in statuses. And I also conducted 2 years of ethnographic field work. I focused on sites where works were produced by making repeated visits to art studios, and on sites where works were selected for exhibition and collection, such as exhibitions, installations, and galleries, exhibition openings, art fairs that people travel from all over the world to attend, and VIP parties for collectors. And I want to mention that the contemporary art world is a center of elite culture. So most works are priced in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of dollars. Collectors usually own thousands of works at these price points, and in fact, they only consider themselves and others to be collectors if they own a storage unit for their art. So this is a symbolic foundation. So these are photos from ethnography, and they show the process of installing an exhibition, socializing in artist studios here, and going to art fairs and parties with collectors. And this picture on the bottom right might look like a museum. This is actually part of a 6-story private home in Manhattan of a collector. So as you can probably tell from looking at these pictures are really different from these pictures here. So these are very different social scenes, artists versus collectors. And it was really interesting to me as an ethnographer, both to traverse these different social spaces, but also to watch them collide, because collectors are going into artist studios and artists are also going to these parties with collectors. Artists in their studios studios, and often I would return to the studio every few months to see how their work had changed. So these are, some people have studios, but most of the time these are really messy and chaotic spaces. It's hard to see this, but there's a picture here with chickens, like chicken coop in the middle of the studio here. So these could be very messy spaces that were just filled with works. Sometimes there were studio assistants that were maybe plugging something into a database or prepping a canvas, but most of the time artists are working alone in their studios. And I mixed these various works at different stages of the creative process. So artist studios were filled with sketches, unfinished work, various models here, finished work that were in storage, various scraps here. And these were important to me methodologically because it allowed me to probe how artists made decisions at different stages in the creative process. So during interviews, I would go through the works on display and I would ask artists to tell me about a certain sketch or an unfinished work. We'd talk about the decisions they've made with that work. And I was also able to see, in some cases, these decisions unfold over time as I repeatedly visited the studio and saw how the works changed, and also attended artist exhibitions and saw how these were circulating through the social world. So I'll now move to the analysis, and I'm going to first show how people in the art world discuss what creativity is. And I'll highlight this idea of having a creative vision. These narratives of creativity are important because they influence how artists experiment in their studios. So then second, moving into the studio, I'll then show how artists use a process of experimentation that results in what they view as having a creative vision. And I'll show how the structure of the creative process itself ultimately reinforces a certain way of judging creativity. And then finally, I'll show how as artists' work circulates through the art world over time, these collective orientations of judging creativity and these perceptions of particular artists' creative visions can ultimately constrain what artists can produce. So taken together, I'll show that even though we're in this world where quote unquote anything goes, artists don't actually experiment with infinite possibilities, but within a set of parameters that they develop over time through experimentation. And these parameters are informed by their interactions in the art world. So ultimately, creativity is bound by the idea of creativity itself and the structure of the creative process. So I'll move to the data now, and we'll sort of jump into the art world. And I'll start by looking at how creativity is judged within the art world. As I'll show, people in the art world discuss good artists as those who have artistic autonomy, aesthetic commitment, and continued experimentation. And together they see these as the mark of a true creative vision. So the first quote here is from a dealer at a critically acclaimed gallery in Chinatown. And we're sitting in the back room of the gallery in the evening after the gallery has closed. And she's stuck at work waiting for an artist who's missing their meeting. So she vents to me, "They are fucking psycho, lazy, useless, undependable." Okay, so artists sometimes, it's probably not their fault that they are completely incapable of taking care of themselves. They are just in a permanent childlike state. And actually making an art and having someone else sell for them is the only way that they could ever survive as people because they would otherwise be homeless. And I guess they can kind of be visionary and inspiring in one way or another, but they are those kinds of really hopeless people. So in this narrative, we get this very pejorative image of an artist as someone who's an incompetent person who can't deal with typical adult responsibilities, but also has the saving grace of being a quote visionary. And this is another dealer in an established Chelsea gallery talking about the roles of dealers in relation to the artists that the gallery represents. So this dealer says, "We are not co-producers of the artwork. So a good art dealer is not trying to influence the way something is going to be created because you are just going to cloud that. If that artist is looking to their art dealer for advice on how to paint something, there is no place for them in this art world. They need to trust their own visions. So you can't be like, I think that should be blue." So this dealer is saying that true artists have to follow their own creative vision, which can't be dictated by others. And I want to highlight a couple points here. So first, artists are seen to be incapable of dealing with non-creative aspects of their professional lives, such as financial decisions. And this is structured organizationally into the art world. So for example, artists represented by dealers do not set their own prices and often do not even know the prices of their own work. However, there's this supposed sphere of aesthetic autonomy surrounding the artist. So artists are supposed to be able to make their own creative decisions and able to find their own way in the studio without having others tell them what to do. And dealers are expected to respect this. So this is also something that's organizationally structured into the art world. Even though dealers often know what's more marketable, to be a good supporter of a creative vision, they have to find indirect ways to tell artists this, and even sometimes when push comes to shove, show work that they do not think will sell. So there's this sphere of creative autonomy. Within this space, artists are supposed to produce this vision. And so we see emerging that this idea that a true artist has to have this creative vision, and that this is what makes their work aesthetically important. Supporting this concept of the creative vision is the idea that true artists have an enduring obsession with or commitment to certain aesthetic themes. So this collector and I visited a studio of an emerging artist in Queens together. The artist spent several years making sculptures of pink pillbox hats meticulously positioned to mirror the trajectory of Jackie O's hat during JFK's assassination. And she did this by analyzing 7 seconds of film footage, frame by frame. So we're in the studio and the artist is taking the collector around, and the collector says, "You are still not done." And the artist says, "No, every time I finish one, I have to make another. I probably have between 4 and 6 left in this section of film." And the collector says, "Oh God, I'm overwhelmed." And then later in the visit, the collector says, "What galleries have come through? What about Tanya Bernhard? This is a very established gallery. She would love this." And the artist said, "I would love an introduction. I haven't really sought out a gallery. I've just been working." And the collector says, "As you should be." And the artist says, "I'm a bit of a cave dweller." And then we're in the cab back to Manhattan at the end of the studio visit, and the collector turns to me and says, "She's obsessed." So here we see both the artist and the collector emphasizing the artist's obsession with this theme, and we also see the artist downplaying professional savviness. So together, the artist and collector communicate their view that continuing to explore the same themes over time represents aesthetic obsession, and that this is the mark of a true creative vision. And as a side note, collectors like doing these studio visits with artists in part because they felt like getting to know the artist personally and seeing their studio space gave them further insight into artists' creative visions, because the creative vision was supposed to be associated with artist identity as a person. While consistency is seen as a mark of a true creative vision, artists are also expected not to take this too far. So here I was walking around a major contemporary art fair with a collector and several of his friends. And the collector stopped in one booth and said, "That's a John Pastoni. It has that look. It doesn't look like anyone else. I could tell right away just by glancing. He added cat litter to this painting to give it a wonderful rough texture. He brought it up a notch. What makes a great artist? You progress. He struggles. If you talk to him, he's like, I don't know. And with any artist, not everything he makes is incredible, but he self-edits." So here we see that there's this consistency because he can tell it's a Pastoni just by looking, but he also highlights that the artist is willing to continue to experiment even to the point of floundering or failing. In this narrative, consistency is seen to be evidence of aesthetic commitment, and variation is seen to be evidence of a willingness to experiment. So in the art world, it wasn't enough just to have consistency or variation, but instead this was something that artists needed to balance and also manage this balance over time. So this brings me to the concept of a creative vision, which is also sometimes called a signature style, although this term can be used pejoratively in the art world. So I define a creative vision as the perception of a bundle of recognizable and enduring elements within an artist's body of work. And people believe that creative visions also evolve over time, so the creative vision embodies these concepts of both consistency as well as variation. This value placed on the creative vision is not just a post hoc justification for why people value the work of artists who are already seen as high status, but something that actually influences people's aesthetic judgments. So for example, I saw collectors pass up new works by well-known artists whose work they already owned because they felt like the new series either was too much of a departure from the previous work or that the artist hadn't changed enough. And more broadly, we can think of creative visions as something that influences aesthetic judgments across creative industries. So, for example, when sociology graduate students go on the job market, as I was talking with a couple of you earlier about, they have to communicate in a job talk in a set of documents, their narrative of their own creative vision. So I call these verbal and written narratives of creative vision style scripts. In communicating these style scripts, they try to show that their creative vision encompasses a cluster of empirical and theoretical interests, which taken together is distinctive. And they also try to chart their past, present, and future research along this coherent trajectory that shows both evolution of the creative vision, while also this maintenance of what keeps and what makes their creative vision distinctive. So this concept of the creative vision is generalizable across creative industries. I'm now going to bring us into the studio so we can see how the creative vision is enacted in the creative process, how an artist creates a body of work that seems to have this true creative vision. So here we're going to see how artists use certain processes of experimentation to create these visions that are deemed to have this balance of consistency and variation. And I'll show how narratives of creativity influenced how artists experimented in the studio, and then also how these narratives were also reinforced by experimentation. Artists recognized that the creative process was highly uncertain. When they experimented with new elements like a new material or technique, they could not quite imagine what results they were going to get. This uncertainty created a risk. They needed to produce work that would be judged as representing a unique creative vision, so they couldn't spend all of their time and money making work that wasn't going to sell. To manage this uncertainty, they used what I call low-stakes experimentation. In other words, they tested out ideas efficiently by using fast processes of production and inexpensive materials. Some common examples of low-stakes experiments for artists are sketches and models. And here you can see some low-stakes experiments, sort of test strips over here. For sociologists, some low-stakes experiments might be notes or early drafts. In this image, you can see two images of artist Davino Stamo's work here. And on the right, you can see these leather test strips that he made to see how the leather would react to cement at various thicknesses. So these were some low-stakes experiments here. And after testing certain elements of the low-stakes experiments, she made these larger pieces, which you can see here. In these full-scale pieces, she also repeated certain elements while varying other conditions. And as she did so, she reduced uncertainty in various elements because she learned how to predict the leather to react to different techniques. So for example, she thought this modeled effect that you can see here was due to the cement dyeing the leather, but when she varied the color of the leather, she realized that it was actually the hot cement burning the leather. As she understood different elements, she started incorporating multiple elements into the same piece, such as hanging chains from the painting or even molding the cement around the leather. You can see the chains here in the back. This process of testing individual elements and then adding them together allowed for more formal complexity. So the process of holding certain elements while varying other elements in order to test their effect is like a simple experiment that scientists use. We can see here that artists allowed heightened uncertainty during low-stakes experimentation and then reduce uncertainty later in the creative process as they develop what I call creative competencies, or more refined expectations of material results through repeated testing. By developing creative competencies, artists made more complex works and also had more control over the creative process. As artists repeated certain elements across different works in order to develop creative competencies, they created consistencies within their bodies of work. So consistencies were a result of developing these creative competencies. Artists' ideas of what was relevant to their creative visions guided initial low-stakes experimentation and served as parameters in the creative process. So this is a quote from artist B. Wirtz, whose work you saw on my book cover. B said, I felt I needed to limit the scope of what was available to me in terms of found objects because it was just too overwhelming. And it makes you have more freedom in a way because you have to be more inventive with what you do. If you limit it, then you have to think of other things to do. So B's work was composed around the theme of bare necessities, what he called eating, sleeping, or eating, drinking, and staying warm. His work involved mostly sculptures made of different mundane objects like clothing or kitchenware, and he would incorporate these with wood, metal, and wire and other materials. These perceptions that these materials and themes were relevant to his creative vision arose through the process of experimentation and then channeled future low-stakes experimentation. So putting parameters on his source material allowed him to do low-stakes experiments in an effective way because it made these possibilities not limitless. The need for parameters were another reason of why these consistencies occurred in the creative process. Otherwise, artists felt like there was infinite possibilities that made things sort of paralyzing. As he produced new work, he looked back on his body of work to identify further consistencies. And this was important in order for him to create this coherent narrative of his creative vision, both to himself and to others. So here B is talking about recognizing consistencies in his work during the process of putting together a retrospective exhibition, which is a big solo exhibition that covers multiple previous series. So B says, I hadn't seen so much of it over such a long period together like that ever before. I was really surprised at how weirdly consistent I had been. And that was interesting to me because I thought this is really who I am, but it wasn't just repeating either. So we see here that artists started by experimenting with ideas that they thought might be relevant to their creative visions, and the process of experimentation required them to repeat certain elements so that they could see how these elements would react to different materials and techniques. And then as they produce these consistencies, they look back at their work and recognize these consistencies, which further strengthens their perception that these elements characterize their distinctive creative vision, and they become more committed to these elements over time. However, artists could not just use the same elements over and over because they would get bored and other people would see their creative visions as stagnant. So they needed a way to introduce variations into the creative process while at the same time making their work still seem representative of their creative visions. So B explains here how he took on new challenges by incorporating material that he did not normally use. And here he's talking about this pink plastic toy given to him by a friend. So B says, I started with this because someone gave me this thing. Some friend had it and he thought, oh, B would like that. And so he said, oh, you can have it. So he gave me that. And this is not something I would normally, well, okay. I use these kind of hanging things, but not like a pink one. So this is a little different, a little weird. And I said, yeah, it's a little too plasticky fabricated. And B says, yeah, kid-like. And so I thought, oh, that's an interesting challenge. What can I do with it? So I had this idea, okay, I think I'll hang wooden clothespins from it. And then I thought, now how am I going to display it? So it was going to be like a smaller thing with something holding it. And then I thought, well, I'll make this bigger structure and then it needs more height. So here you can see the structure here that B builds around this pink plastic toy in the middle in an effort to make this fit within his body of work. But when I returned a few months later, the structure was still there, but the pink plastic toy had been replaced by this cloth red napkin here. And the napkin was related to the concept of domesticity, which was prevalent in his work, but unlike the pink plastic toy, the napkin was made with what he viewed as a more natural material, cloth, and a palette that was more similar to his other works. So this was a case where an artist tried, but ultimately did not use a new element because the artist could not experiment to the point where he felt like the work was both representative of his enduring commitment and his desire for continued experimentation. So ultimately, the work just didn't represent his creative vision to him. A couple months later, when I visited B, he was working on this new piece, which he called Kitchen Trees. B was invited to do a public art sculpture for a public art fund, which is an arts nonprofit in New York City, which was ultimately displayed in City Hall Park in downtown Manhattan. The work had to be large scale and weatherproof, which created a challenge since he usually made small sculptures with everyday objects. So he had to figure out how to make it fit with his creative vision, while also incorporating new elements. And ultimately, he made this work out of durable materials like colanders and plastic vegetables that still connected to these themes of domesticity. So as we can see here, artists use processes of experimentation that allow them to produce and recognize consistencies that they associate with their creative visions, while also introducing new elements that they come to associate with their creative visions. The creative vision becomes something that artists and others can recognize without being static. Artists' processes of experimentation are influenced by these narratives of creativity, but narratives of creativity are also influenced by how artists and others perceive the creative process. For example, dealers are exposed to the creative process through their interactions with artists in studio visits. They see that different artists have different levels of creative output based on their techniques and also go through ebbs and flows in the creative process. And dealers develop organizational practices around these understandings of the creative process, such as having different artists exhibit their works at different frequencies or having somewhat flexible exhibition schedules. While artists can, in theory, experiment with infinite elements, in practice, artists' actual creative processes are bound in different ways. So I'll end by discussing the different ways that the creative process is bound by the social world. As we've seen so far, artists are influenced by narratives of creativity that circulate in the art world. And as artists experiment and bring these narratives into their studios, they repeat certain elements and associate their work with these elements in a way that they come to see as parameters on the kind of work they make. So practices of experimentation, which are related to these narratives of creativity, also bound the creative process. Finally, as works leave the studio, we'll now see how other people's perceptions of specific creative visions further place boundaries on how artists experiment. And I'll discuss this last point using the case of Bernhard. Catherine first became known for her sloppily painted fashion models, as you can see here, which sold well and received positive reviews. After a couple of years, Catherine felt like she was finished with these works and began making collaborative works with her husband, consisting of collaging African textiles on canvas, which she referred to as rug paintings, as seen on the right-hand corner of the photo with Catherine and her son here. So Catherine described the difficulty of exhibiting and selling the rug paintings. She said Canada, this is actually the name of her gallery, said that they wanted to show paintings only from me, not collaborative works. When they told me that, I was only making collages. So I was like, whatever, I'm making collages. So I made them anyway, and we had to show at the Wohl. And the Wohl was a lesser known gallery in Brooklyn. So after the collages, Canada was still like, we want a painting show, painting. So I was like, okay, and I came up with this. And having witnessed these conversations, this probably was communicated in a more indirect way, but nevertheless, this was the clear message that Catherine took away. So Catherine showed me her new series, which were paintings filled with cigarettes, lipstick, and juice boxes in the same sloppily painted style as her previous series of models, and told me that the series sold out. Although Catherine initially sidestepped Canada's refusal of her new works by continuing to produce the rug collages, she ultimately returned to producing series in her more recognizable painting style and exhibiting them at Canada. A year later, I walked into Canada's booth at Frieze, one of New York's biggest fairs, and asked the dealer the price of Catherine's two paintings of toilet paper, tacos, and Pac-Man, one of which you can see here, as well as the price of her 3 rug collages, one of which you can see here. So he replies that the paintings cost $25,000 and $30,000 each, but the rug collages were only $6,000 each, which were among the cheapest paintings at the fair. So why the price discrepancy, I asked? They're about the same size. And he said, well, she's really more noted for these kinds of paintings. So here we can see that when artists become known for certain kinds of work, this is the work that is most in demand and priced the highest. And this is because collectors value the artist for what they believe is original about their work, and they view that this originality is encapsulated by the iconic work, the sort of creative vision here. So deviating from iconic elements is a big risk for artists, especially established artists who are well known for these elements. As we saw from the creative process, developing creative competencies in order to make a new series takes a lot of time and effort. And on top of this, artists can be judged as not committed enough to the new idea for it to be considered a core part of their creative vision. So it's really hard to develop new elements and then also to then have these elements recognized as iconic, and it becomes more difficult the more established you are. So artists who become noted for certain elements can face challenges when they try to introduce new variations, even if, in theory, dealers and collectors think they should be free to experiment. So I'm going to end with some conclusions here. So artists' distinctive creative visions arise through the ongoing creative process through which artists experiment and identify with certain core and enduring elements. I started with this question of how artists make creative decisions without a consensus in the field about what is good art. And artists deal with this by sidestepping objectivity when it comes to aesthetic judgment. So when I started my research, I was asking artists to tell me about what work was good or bad and how they knew. And it took me some time to realize that this question wasn't working, because artists didn't judge their own work as objectively good or bad. Instead, they judged it in terms of its relevance to their creative visions. In the art world, this idea of having a creative vision, which is demonstrated by aesthetic autonomy and a balance of consistency and variation, is essential. So artists' perceptions of their creative vision arise through the process of experimentation. And through these moment-to-moment decisions, artists develop a cluster of consistencies within their bodies of work, which they come to recognize as their creative vision. Ultimately, creativity is bound by narratives of creativity, artists' parameters developed during the creative process, and others' perceptions of artists' creative visions. So more broadly, I propose an approach to theorizing the creative process as a sequence of judgments directed towards objects that's oriented by social values. And I'll quickly break that down. So sequence of judgments. I think it's important for those studying judgment to not only focus on discrete moments of judgment, but instead to look at how multiple moments of judgments are linked together. In the creative process, artists don't just conceive of an object and then execute it, but instead make a sequence of decisions in response to an evolving object. Methodologically, I think this can be captured by focusing not only on how judgments of creative works, completed work, but also tracing the intermediate products like sketches and models throughout the creative process. And then directing this towards objects. So as I said, these judgments are attached to evolving objects, which requires attention both to the materiality of the objects and also how multiple people's judgments of the same objects relationally intersect. And then finally, oriented by social values. So even when artists are alone, their judgments are oriented by these broader orientations towards judgment, which are influenced by their social interactions. So for example, ideas about what a creative vision is and why it's valuable shape how artists judge particular works. So I see these gaps in the way that we currently theorize aesthetic judgment, and this approach allows for aesthetic judgment to be theorized in production as something that's relationally influenced as well as temporally linked. So thank you so much, and I would love to discuss this with you and hear your questions.
So on the Q&A side, if you want to take questions from the room, I'll just field anything that comes in through Zoom, and I'll just send a message to everyone. I think actually somebody on the Zoom call, Catherine, do you want to unmute and just see if you can, oh wait, I might need to give you permission to unmute. Yeah, Catherine, do you want to unmute and just see if you can come through clearly?
Hi. I just unmuted.
I can hear.
Okay, cool. So we might need to repeat the question just so that the entire room can hear, but anyone who wants to ask a question from the Zoom call can do so. Just signal to me by raising your hand in the Zoom call, and I'll pass that on to Seth, who will run the Q&A. Does that sound good to everyone?
Thank you so much for a great talk. It was really fun to learn more about the art world. I would love to hear more about the ethnographic process itself. How did you get access to all different stages? How much knowledge did you have about art itself before going into this project?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the knowledge, I'm like a mediocre artist. So I had some background knowledge of technique, as well as like, I think I'm like a slightly less mediocre art historian. So like I had got like had a pretty good basis for art history, some knowledge of like technique, and I think this sort of embodied knowledge of like the studio and the creative process. And that was actually really helpful in terms of, I think artists would have talked to me anyway, but at least in terms of like the depth of conversation and being able to sort of understand and follow up on what they were saying, and sort of appreciate the background of contemporary art. So that was sort of the knowledge side. The access side, I went in with very few ties to the art world. I had sort of a couple of friends of friends of friends who gave me contacts. I started by interviewing artists, and that was actually pretty easy to get artists access to artists, because studio visits is sort of an institutionalized thing in the art world. So when I asked for an interview in their studios, they sort of understood that as a studio visit. And also like artists like to talk about their work and like to have people in their studios and like to even get feedback on the work. And so it wasn't too hard. I couldn't really get to like the superstars. Like I wasn't able to interview Jeff Koons, although I did send many emails to like jkoons@gmail.com, hoping that I would get the right one. But I don't think I did. I started with interviewing artists. Then I was able to also interview dealers, because both dealers and artists have like a public persona of like public contact information on the internet. So that wasn't too hard. It took me some time to get to the more established galleries. What was the toughest was getting to collectors, because artists are really protective and dealers are really protective of their relationships with collectors, and rightly so. They're very financially dependent on these relationships. They had little to gain from me, right? So it was a big ask. And finally, the way I got to collectors was that a very established dealer who was really generous offered to reach out on my behalf to several collectors to see if they'd be willing to have me interview. And this was a dealer that was so well established that collectors were sort of fighting for access to her gallery. So it was like the collectors were more dependent on her. So it's a couple galleries, or a couple collectors said they were willing to do an interview. And once I interviewed a couple collectors, that really like blew open the doors for me, because collectors don't actually think it's a big deal. Like they were willing to, they would be like, oh yeah, now talk to my friend. They're all friends with each other. And so it wasn't a big deal for them to refer me to their friends. They weren't like, they didn't feel like they had this economically dependent relationship that they were really concerned with. And then I think like one thing that might be useful like for grad students is that for me at least, the relationship between fieldwork and interviews was really symbiotic, in that at the end of interviews, I not only asked people for like referrals to other people, but I would also rudely ask if I could hang out with them. And so I'd be like, hey, I know this is awkward, but I'm like trying to do this dissertation. So like, can I tag along the next time you go to galleries, or like, can I come to the like a party that you're having? And like, it was really uncomfortable, but I sort of like forced myself to do it. And sometimes people say no, and sometimes people say yes. And then field work also gave me more access to interviews, because then I would go to like a party and meet a bunch of other collectors and ask if I could interview them. So I found that there was like this really symbiotic relationship between the two. Thank you. Oh, wow. I'll let you.
Tom, Pat.
You got one on the Zoom call.
I think this was a really great talk. I just like, you said that creativity is bound by narratives of creativity, but I think it seems to me that it is also bound to some extent by artists' need to sell the work and to make a living.
Yeah.
I don't know, so I was wondering if you could say a couple words about
Yeah, that's a really great question. Something I didn't really get to talk about that much within the talk, but is actually a big part of the book. So like here I sort of presented it as this like intuitive thing going on in the studio that was like artists and their materials. but they're not only like the way, and I showed at the end how there's sort of like economic impacts, right? Like if someone's not going to buy this work because it's seen as too much of a deviation. But that was actually a big thing for artists that they considered and impacted how they did their work. So in Catherine's case, she initially sort of ignores it, but then ultimately does go back to producing work in her more iconic style. And I found that artists had different impacts depending on their career stage. So really like what I think of as like almost uninitiated artists who have had like very few solo shows or have no solo shows. There's not a built-up expectation of what their creative vision is. No one knows their creative vision. So they're really trying to make a mark on the art. And so they are sort of pressured to show a narrow, distinctive element. And so something that is like an unusual media, like pipe cleaners or something like that, works really well because it's something that sticks in people's mind. And then people say, oh, the pipe cleaner guy. So that's like what sort of can get artists sort of off the ground. And then as they become a little more established, then they're tasked with like linking these things together. So what's like, now they have a few solo shows. So now what's the next solo show, which is different, but also enough, but also sort of consistent at the same time. And artists really struggle with that. Like one artist called it like overcoming success. Which I thought was like an interesting way of saying it. So now they're like a little bit recognized that they have to like keep overcoming success and make the next thing and the next thing, which is like different enough, but also enough of the same. And then when artists are like more at this level of being super established where everyone really strongly associates their work with one or a couple iconic elements, that's when like they really struggle to produce work that deviates from those elements and actually sell that work. So at different points, there's sort of different perceptions of the creative vision based on the level of recognition of the artist and also based on the actual like material exhibition opportunities. So like showing one work in a group show allows you to show less breadth within your creative vision than like a retrospective exhibition where you can link together multiple series. And that creates sort of different economic and social pressures that pressures artists sort of to produce different kinds of creative visions across their sort of career stages.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for the talk. I was really forward to it. You came to share your work. I had a question about the format of the actual artwork and what role it plays in kind of communicating or forming a creative vision. In particular, you've shown the slide of paid versus public art versus art that is kind of impossible, in a way impossible to sell. Like, so for example, the example that I could think of from a friend of mine was a full gallery length shelf with cans of beans on it. Obviously, that's something that's not to be sold, I don't think. Versus things that are actually can be portable or bought and sold. What role do the different formats play, or did anything come out in how the artists talk about their work and the roles in which the different formats they are played in kind of communicating their vision or creating opportunities to articulate it or change it or something like that?
Yeah, I would say like I mean a primary one is like this sort of, they call it like they would make these like non-sellable works, like the pile of rubble I showed in the beginning was like a work that no one expected to sell. But like if you look closely, there was actually like little paintings on the back wall of the gallery, and those would sell. So the non-sellable work creates prestige for both the artist and the gallery, because the gallery is saying, look how I'm concerned, we're good supporters of the creative vision. We'll support anything, even if we're not going to make money off of it. And that also makes the artists have like high critical acclaim and distances them from this commercial orientation. But then they do have sellable works that even if they're not shown in the gallery, you can buy them from the back room. The gallery represents the whole body of work of the artist. And sometimes, and there's sort of different channels of visibility. So these non-sellable works will sometimes be acquired by museums, but even if they're not acquired, they'll be shown in museum spaces as well as sometimes gallery spaces. But galleries also balance sort of their non-selling shows with their selling shows. So the artist will know, okay, for the Venice Biennale, I'll do this like crazy thing that I can never sell. This like gives me the prestige. And then for this next thing, I can do this thing that would sell. Or even if I show this thing that wouldn't sell, you could go find out what other works you could buy. So they're seen to sort of balance the commercial prestige and make it so that artists aren't too threatened with looking too commercial, which is especially important as artists get more successful. They run a risk of being judged as sellouts. And I'll have to like think more about how this relates to the creative vision, other than that, like there's almost different channels of circulation for different kinds of work. And dealers are really intentional about how they expose different audiences to the work. So if you're having like the 4th gallery show at this gallery, right, then the dealer is okay with showing non-iconic work. But if the artist is showing in Switzerland for the first time ever, the gallery will want the artist to show the more iconic work because they want to educate the audience properly of this is the iconic creative vision of this artist. And only once you know that vision can you sort of get into the nuanced details of the less iconic work.
Thanks so much.
So Ethan, and then we'll take.
I also really enjoyed the talk. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions, if that's okay. The first is I wanted to know, or I wanted you to explain maybe a bit more the relationship between the dealer, collector, and artist, because in one where they were doing the Jackie O hat, it was the collector who was going directly to the artist, but then another time there was a dealer who was brokering. So how do those, are there norms around how those relationships operate? And then also, and this is like perhaps totally wrong, so you can just punt this one away if you want to, but I gather, are these like necessarily mutually exclusive categories? Like for example, I recently read an obituary of an artist and it was like, you know, her name, comma, artist, curator, and art dealer passed. So like, aren't artists also collecting other artists' art, and aren't they curating up? So how does that fit in? And then my second question is around, I was really interested when you like linked this to like science or like social science. And just there's so much overlap between experimentation, you linked it to our job market materials, that's the way that we like create narratives about ourselves. So is it like, so to what extent does your theory sort of, can it really be transferable to both the creative vision, but also like a productive vision more broadly among like those of us who are producing science, for example, like social scientists versus those who are producing art?
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Those are really great. Yeah, so in terms of like the dealer-artist relationship, so even like in that case of the collector in the artist studio, even if the collector would say like, okay, I'm gonna buy that now, the artist still has to go through the gallery, and the gallery is still gonna get, if the artist is represented and like the artist wants to be represented, because that's like a huge status signal and gives you access to a lot more dealers. And so there's always, and I like, it's extremely rare to like almost non-existent that an artist or a collector would try to lie about that, because it's such a close-knit art world, and that in the art world is based on like handshake agreements and trust, and in instances where trust is broken, people get like totally blacklisted. And so there's very little like lying about it. The only situation which is sort of seen as acceptable for artists to do without their dealers is what like artist trades, which also goes to what you were saying about multiple roles. So it was pretty common to have an artist who was also a curator. Usually if that was the case, it was like, or a dealer, if that was the case, it was usually like a smaller artist run gallery in Brooklyn or something like that. So they would overlap, but with certain in certain like ways, where often they felt like one role was primary, and artists would trade works with each other. So this was a really interesting gift economy where there's like norms of the trade, like you're supposed to give sort of like an equally significant work to the other person, and like the status between the artists shouldn't be that different. If it is, it should really be the higher status artist initiating, things like that. And so there's a lot of sort of interesting things there. In terms of power dynamics, like there was a lot of really interesting power dynamics between artists and collectors, where collectors framed this as, even though they were economically like dealing with real money here, it was still disposable income for them, even though they did see it as like an asset class. And a huge part of the reason they liked it was like socializing with their friends, this sort of cultural experience they were getting. So collectors describe their relationships with artists in terms of leisure and friendship. Artists never describe their relationships with collectors this way. They would, and there was an awkward dynamic where the collector is having a great time and the artist is really like nervous in this like VIP party, and like they feel like their career is on the line, and but they can't sort of show that they're not having a great time. So for artists, it's always, even when they like collectors, at least in part work. So there was very different definitions of the situation, and the only collector that showed and acknowledged to me that an awareness of these power dynamics and actually felt like they should be more distanced from artists because of it was by far the lowest status collector that I interviewed. So there was very little awareness among collectors of these power dynamics. And then the final thing was sort of the generalizability of this. Yeah, so they sort of purposely threw those comparisons into the talk because I wanted people to think about these processes more broadly. So I'm really glad you picked up on that. And that's exactly right. Like I see the creative process as pretty generalizable. So like the way we do low stakes experimentation, the way we recognize consistencies in our work as sociologists, the way sort of we like develop a body of work. But also in terms of communicating our creative vision to other people and the way our work is being evaluated. I think it's also really essential for sociologists to be able to communicate, this is my creative vision, this is what makes my work distinctive, this is how you can see this evolution through my various projects, which may have happened in random ways, but I'm going to communicate it to you as part of this beautiful trajectory here. And now you'll see how I'm evolving, but still consistent, right? So I think creative visions are like really central to both experimentation as well as the way our work is judged as sociologists. Thank you.
Okay, I don't have anyone currently on the list from the Zoom gang. Does anyone want to jump in with a question from the online side of things? Okay, seeing, oh wait, Sean Mauer, go ahead and unmute.
Hey, can you hear me okay? Yeah, so maybe I'll just, I find the idea of the creative vision interesting, and yeah, and I think it makes sense, like you're just replying to Ethan, that it would be sort of every individual in this kind of world would be working with these same kind of dynamics. But I'm kind of still wondering about like, what are the boundaries around which these creative visions you're finding? So like, it's basically, I'm just kind of wondering, like, is there a way that your creative vision can kind of explain like trends in the art world, for instance? Like, how does a creative vision fit within different kinds of trends? And with the creative vision you're describing here, would that be the same creative vision that happened, like, say, in New York in the 40s or something like that too? Like, is it so there's this individual process, but it seems like I'm just kind of wondering, like, how is it the same? Is it different? And can you explain trends or different schools of approaches, those kinds of things?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I'll start by sort of addressing the historical question, which is that like creative visions have been around for a long time, but have gotten historically much more important in the art world because of both organizational changes as well as art historical changes. So like organizationally, the dealer system moving from art academies to dealers, which White and White talks about in Canvases and Careers, moved from selling discrete works to selling bodies of work. So this placed the original emphasis on the creative vision. And then, as the art world became more globalized, more financialized, there was more and more competition around the creative vision. And then art historically, like just very briefly, this is a long, complicated history, but there was this successive art movements through like the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s. And then we reached with like minimalism, like what we called like the end of art, because basically there was this successive breaching of various like parameters of what we viewed as art. So, okay, art couldn't be this. Now someone reached that and called it art, and now art could be that. And when we reached minimalism, now art could be like a blank canvas. It could be anything. There were no more boundaries to be breached. And so the avant-garde, sort of the cutting edge of the edge of cutting edge sort of disintegrated. It wasn't clear to people what was more cutting edge anymore. And there was then this hodgepodge of styles. So when we got this hodgepodge of styles, people stopped putting themselves centrally into camps or genres. And instead of being like, I'm a pop artist, they would be like, I use references from pop, from this, from this, from this, and more emphasize their creative vision. So the creative vision became more art historically and organizationally important over time. And then, there is like still like trends in the art world. So there's like these people are not just trying to find like resonances with their own creative visions, but also with like their sort of broader lived experience and what's going on in the art world. And so, but they connect to other people through these references. They wouldn't say like, oh, I'm in a camp with so-and-so. They would say like, we both use this reference. So it's like connecting on one element of their creative vision. And these elements can sort of be reactive to what is going on in the world. So for example, like I was interviewing artists when Trump was elected, and work became a lot more political during that time. And so that became a more common reference that people would use in their creative vision. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, so I was wondering, did you find in your interviews like social media or the online art world as a kind of effects on or creating an effect on the kind of creative visions of people? So like, for example, in street photography, because I practice street photography, you might have like an image that comes out of New York that is really cool to somebody, but they'll take certain elements and then kind of replicate it in a different city. So
yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, like academics use Twitter, artists use Instagram because of the format. So like it's like a more visual format, and especially the younger artists would use it. It was mostly like about sort of visibility in the same way that they were using like their websites, but they did sometimes use it to test, to like as like almost a critique. Instead of people coming into their studio, they would show works in different stages of progress. They also said that like they would sort of like pay attention somewhat to how many likes different things got, not as like not super closely, but they'd be like, oh, okay, like I guess it would be sort of this really rough measure of resonance for them. Like, oh, okay, I'm kind of surprised I just like threw this thing up there, but people seem to like react to it positively. So yeah, maybe I'll think more about that. It was like kind of, that was how they were using it.
Yeah, I think this is awesome. I really heard this. I was in terms of how much of, I'm curious about creative visions as like post hoc justifications for what people are doing or like explanations.
I know.
Like if some people feel pressure to like align their creative visions with like ascribed sociodemographic characteristics that are like desirable for like collectors or dollars to consume. And just more about like navigating that as like an external or exogenous pressure. And then of course, like, and are there any negative cases? Like, are there any artists who just sort of forget this? Like, I'm not doing this. Is that like a strategy that one could take if they wanted, or is the market and the field like so dependent on narrative, like kind of like career narrative?
Yeah,
meaning making that like you couldn't even say like, no, like this is just the thing I'm doing.
Yeah, so those are really great questions. So in terms of like the socio-demographics of it, so yeah, there's sort of two sides of this that I think of, like the production side and the reception side. So definitely I saw like artists of color more likely would reference race as a part of their vision. Similarly, like female artists more likely discussing gender, femininity, domesticity, things like that. Feminism as like an important reference point. So like you saw that on the production side but it wasn't like absolute. There wasn't like a one-to-one link. And then on the reception side, you also saw that even when artists sometimes didn't ascribe it themselves, people sort of making these connections. And sometimes artists would reject these connections. So like, you know, like an example of an artist saying like, something looked like ovaries, the artist was like, no, this isn't what it is. This is about war. You're not describing it this way. And was really insistent that the gallerist not describe it that way, even if the collector came in and read that into it and was like more likely to buy it because of that, saying, no, this was not the meaning I wanted. So you do see those like rejections sometimes. And then on the collector side, I think there's like, I mean, I drew on your work here actually on encultured biases, because this was something I saw as a problem with collectors, where collectors also conceive of their own creative visions as collectors. So they, and they see themselves as creators in a way, so do dealers, in that both people are composing bodies of work. The dealers are doing it in terms of their gallery programming, the exhibitions. The collectors do a new rehanging of their collection every 6 months to a year. They're composing this body of work that's their collection, and then creating this conversation in their hanging. And they saw it as relevant to their own lived experience and talked about their personal connections to each work. Collectors would like, but were less likely to buy works that were overtly violent or disturbing, because they did not want to hang it and be seeing that like while they were eating breakfast every day. And sometimes they also didn't like feel a personal connection to works that were dealing with like a theme of slavery. So I saw one case where a collector bought something, took it home, and then the collector's wife said like she didn't like the work and needs to be sent back. It was like a work dealing with slavery, and she just like didn't feel a connection to it, and said like it was like a really sort of graphic work. She said she didn't want to be looking at it while she was like eating every day. And so that's a thing. So that was something where the idea of a creative vision could kind of legitimize people not buying the work of certain artists, because they would say, no, it's a great work. It's just not for me. It's just not relevant to my creative vision. It's not objectively bad. And so sort of legitimizing based on sort of taste and legitimating this connection that you're supposed to have. And right now there's sort of more of a, since I left the field with like BLM, there's been now more of an effort, but there's really few, there's not a lot of Black artists being represented by galleries, because historically there wasn't this level of demand, and now the galleries are like really trying to catch up and correct for that, because now there is more of a demand there. And then in terms of negative cases, so some artists would say like, I don't have a style. I do like a really broad range of works. I work across all different media. So sort of rejected this idea of a style, but they didn't really reject the idea of a creative vision. When they rejected an idea of a style, they were really more rejecting this idea of narrow formal elements and saying that I have conceptual themes that are broad, that can that take many different forms. And so I'm trying to think, it would be really hard to like reject the idea of having any sort of continued interest where each work was entirely sort of like free flowing or like disconnected and like had no connection to any other work you ever made. Like that's like almost hard for me to imagine how there would be like no formal or conceptual connections. And artists never said that. It was more rejecting of like a narrow formal style.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the differences between collaborative creative process and sort of one. And I think because to build on Ethan's question, I mean, we think of sociology as like the lone wolf, you know, you have to be this solo author person, whereas a lot of other sciences encourage things like collaborative processes, which I'm just curious, you know, what's the difference between the jazz musicians and the artists? How does that change the process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I think I almost used it as like a methodological or like a theoretical or methodological device, which was to say that like when we focus on the jazz musicians, we focus on their interaction instead of like the underlying like orientation to judgment. And so then I'm trying to think, okay, but what's like the substantive difference in terms of the underlying orientation to judgment? And now I'm sort of like making this up on the spot, so I don't know if this is right. But perhaps it's that like the difference between negotiating multiple creative visions together to create like one overarching creative vision. Like I'm thinking of like a band where everyone has like their distinctive thing that they have to like negotiate together, and sometimes probably has like slight disagreements about how the way, like the best way it should be done based on and again, I think a lot of the work, like I'm thinking about Gary Fine's work on kitchens, where it's like they do talk about how people like this push and pull of like negotiating with other people in that process. So I think like, you know, you only have yourself to negotiate with, and maybe you negotiate with like, I think it's also like maybe relational versus collaborative. So if you have a jazz trio, you're like interactionally involved with everyone and collaborating. And that's the sort of one of the social impacts on the creative process. If you remove that immediate interaction, the social impact on the creative process is relational, in that it's like the artist knows, okay, my dealer said this, or this collector likes this type of work, or this is the thing that's going to sell, but it's not this like direct unmediated interaction in the moment. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this.
Well, I didn't know if you would have an answer, because I know it's beyond like exactly what you're doing, but you know, I'm just thinking through my head, like this problem of legibility, right? It's like Miles Davis, is famous, and he's like the solitary artist. He just puts these bands together, and then they become known, and then he breaks them up. And sometimes it works when he tries to put out something new, and sometimes there's this huge pushback, right? And so there's this negotiation constantly between what people are expecting from him. But then there are bands that are, you know, like purely what you're talking about, a bunch of parts that come together to create this like larger whole. That is just
right. Yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting case, because it's like a single artist that has their own creative vision and the perceptions of that, but then each group becomes like almost like what artists, almost like a separate series maybe coming off, or I think of more albums as the series. And so one thing I like want to have more of a focus on is like the sort of body of work, and how the body of work sort of is produced and circulated over time as this, what I think of as like a distributed object. And so so this artist has this distributed object, which is also attached to like different groups of people as you create different bands over time, but also different albums, and how are those all connected. And maybe creating a different band allows you a little bit more distance from your creative vision, because you're saying this isn't me as a solo artist, but this is me as a separate band. Yeah, there's like work on how like DJs use different like names for different kinds of performances. So there's people that and again, like actually using pseudonyms is a common way that people in other fields will gain more artistic freedom in a way. So like if J.K. Rowling wants to do this like mystery thing, then she can like use a pseudonym, and then it's like more detached from the Harry Potter series.
Thank you. I think that's it for time, but thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming out during the pandemic. I appreciate it.